Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session of the Leuven Seminar in Classical German Philosophy. I'm very happy to welcome you all and to welcome tonight's guest, Professor Abraham Anderson. Abraham Anderson is a professor in the Department of Philosophy at the American University in Cairo. He has taught or held fellowships in the US, Mexico, France, Germany, and England. He is the author of numerous articles on Kant and Hume, and of course, the author of the book that we will be discussing this evening, which is Kant, Hume, and the Interruption of Dogmatic Slumber, which was published last year by Oxford University Press. The format of this evening will be that we will discuss the preface and chapter 2 of Abraham's book. So these have been made available in advance on the website of the Leuven seminar. I will put the link into the chat in case anybody hasn't already downloaded these. So first we will have a talk of around 10 minutes by Abraham introducing the book and the chapters, and then a response of about 15 minutes by Pavl Raichel, to which Abraham will have the opportunity to reply. And then we will open the floor for questions and discussion. And so before I hand over to Abraham, I will also introduce Pavl. So from beginning this month, along with Karen de Boer, Pavl is leading the research project called The Historical Turn in Post-Kantian Philosophy, 1790 to 99 at KU Leuven. Pavl is the author of various papers on Kant, Fichte, and the historiography of philosophy, including one that is particularly relevant for today's discussion, titled Kant's Response to Hume on Natural Theology, Dogmatic Anthropomorphism, Analogical Inference, and Symbolic Representation, which is forthcoming in the Journal of the History of Philosophy. So without further ado, I will hand over to Professor Abraham Anderson, who will introduce his book, Kant, Hume, and the Interruption of Dogmatic Slumber. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I'd like to thank Karen de Boer for inviting me to speak and Pavl Raichel for commenting on my book. And I thank all of you for your interest and your questions. It's an honor to be here. In Kant, Hume, and the Interruption of Dogmatic Slumber, I try to understand Kant's confession in the preface to the Prolegomena that it was the objection of David Hume that first, many years before, interrupted his dogmatic slumber. There's an interpretation of Kant's confession that was put forward by Weihinger in 1881 and that has remained quite influential. According to that response, Hume woke Kant by attacking the principle that every event has a cause, which Kant defends in the second analogy of experience. The problem with this hypothesis is that it does not correspond to what Kant says in the preface. Hume's question, Kant tells us there, was not whether the concept of cause was correct, usable, and indispensable for the whole knowledge of nature, for this Hume never doubted, but whether it had an origin in reason, and might therefore have an application beyond objects of experience. The application Kant has in mind, presumably, is to God and immaterial souls. This description of Hume's question explicates Kant's initial discussion of Hume in the preface, in which he says that Hume attacked metaphysics. First, on Kant's account, Hume demonstrated incontrovertibly that no one can know a priori and merely from concepts, that because one thing is, another must necessarily exist also. From this, he concluded that the concept of cause is a bastard of the imagination produced by habit, that there is no metaphysics and cannot be any. Kant's reference to the objection of David Hume, which first interrupted his dogmatic slumber, must be read in terms of this description of Hume's question and Hume's attack on metaphysics. How, though, did Hume's reflection on the connection between cause and effect constitute an attack on metaphysics, as Kant says it did? This is clear enough with respect to Hume's empiricist conclusions, If we cannot even think a cause beyond experience, well, that's an attack on metaphysics. But if we suppose that Hume's initial demonstration concerned only the relation between cause and effect in experience, it would be hard to understand how that demonstration formed part of an attack on metaphysics, qua science of things beyond experience. To address this problem, I propose that Hume's demonstration implies that we are not entitled to an unrestricted causal principle which goes beyond experience and which would allow us to infer from the existence of the world that of a cause of the world. If Hume attacked metaphysics by showing that we are not entitled to such a causal principle, then he roused Kant in the first instance by showing him that we are not entitled to infer the existence of a divine cause. Karen de Boer, too, has argued that what roused Kant was Hume's argument that we cannot prove the existence of such a cause. Is it plausible, however, to read Kant as saying that Hume roused him from dogmatic slumber in the first instance by showing that we are not entitled to an unrestricted causal principle which would ground a causal proof of the existence of God? In order to address this question, I begin in the first chapter by arguing that the preface of the Prolegomena portrays Hume's attack on metaphysics as part of the struggle with theological dogmatism. In the second chapter, I argue that we cannot interpret Kant's reference to Die Erinnerung des David Hume, which first interrupted his dogmatic slumber, as having to do with a memory, as is sometimes done, but that it must be read as continuous with his earlier descriptions of Hume's attack on metaphysics and Hume's question. Where, though, did Kant get his description of Hume's initial demonstration? In chapter 3, I show that it corresponds precisely to the language of Inquiry 4 and of 4.13, paragraph 13, the end of part 1 of section 4 in particular. In so doing, I am agreeing with many other scholars, from Louis Robinson, French scholar in the early 20s, to Michael Friedman. It has not generally been acknowledged, however, that Hume's argument bears on the unrestricted causal principle, or the rationalist principle of sufficient reason, nor that Kant reads it in this way. This is, I argue, implied by Inquiry 4.13, where Hume says, when we reason a priori and consider merely any object or cause as it appears to the mind, independent of all observation, it never could suggest to us the idea of any distinct object, such as its effect, much less show us the inseparable and inviolable connection between them. We also find such evidence in the footnote to Inquiry 12, paragraph 29, where Hume says, that impious maxim of the ancient philosophy, ex nihilo nihil fit, by which the creation of matter was excluded, ceases to be a maxim, according to this philosophy. Not only the will of the Supreme Being may create matter, but for all we know a priori, the will of any other being might create it, or any other cause that the most whimsical imagination can assign. Hume presents this maxim as if he were talking of the principle by which Lucretius excluded the creation of matter. This principle was also, however, used by Descartes, Locke, and Clarke to prove creation, and Hume indicates that his creation of it tells against such proofs by saying, not only the will of the Supreme Being may create matter, but for aught we know a priori, the will of any other being might create it, or any other cause that the most whimsical imagination can assign. For this implies that we cannot use the principle to prove the existence of a divine creator. Why then, if he wishes to refer to the modern causal principle used to demonstrate the existence of God, does Hume speak of it as a maxim of the ancients, and indeed as an impious maxim? He does so, I propose, precisely to veil, though unlikely, the fact that he is attacking modern theology. In my fourth chapter, I support this claim through an examination of Hume's discussion of the causal principle in the treatise. I do not do this because I suppose that it was this discussion which first interrupted Kant's dogmatic slumber, as the Weihinger thesis would have it, but to support my reading of the passages Inquiry 4.13 and 12.29 note D, which I referred to earlier, as showing that Hume contested not the causal principle governing experience, but the principle used to demonstrate the existence of God. As Kant would have seen, it bore not just on the Cartesian causal principle, but on the rationalist principle of sufficient reason, which Wolff had used to prove the existence of God. In my 5th chapter, I investigate the critique in order to confirm the importance for Kant of Hume's rejection of the principle ex nihilo nihil fit as a rejection of the rationalist causal principle. I find echoes of that attack in various places in the critique, in the transcendental ideal, the postulates of empirical thought, the analogies of experience, and the antinomy. It should be mentioned that this interpretation of Kant's description of the first step in Hume's attack on metaphysics makes it possible to resolve another question. In a letter which Kant wrote to Garve in 1798, he says that it was the antinomy which first woke him from dogmatic slumber. This assertion has seemed to contradict what Kant says in the Prolegomena, if one supposes that Kant is saying that Hume woke him via an attack on the principle that every event has a cause, since that principle is not attacked in the antinomy. If, however, we suppose that he is saying that Hume roused him in the first instance by attacking the rationalist principle of sufficient reason, the problem can be resolved, since the antinomy, as Sadiq al-Azm has proposed, can be read as a series of conflicts between interpretations of the principle of sufficient reason. If one reads Kant's confession about Hume in this way, it can be reconciled with his declaration to Garve that it was the antinomy which woke him, if we suppose that the antinomy is a device for generalizing Hume's challenge to the dogmatic use of the principle. While it was the objection of David Hume that first interrupted his dogmatic slumber, that is, which put him on the path to the discovery of transcendental idealism, it was the antinomy which fully woke him. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so now we will turn immediately to a response from Pavl Raichel.
Okay, thank you very much for that summary and indeed for the book. I think it's genuinely welcome, an insightful take on an old and often excessively narrowly conceived problem. So I'm going to limit myself to the bits that we read, so the preface and chapter 2. Okay, so as mentioned, the primary intention of the book and of the chapter we read in particular is to frame Kant's engagement with Hume around the problem of metaphysics, rather than more narrowly around the problem of the concept of cause. The broader aim of this project, or of the book, as stated in the preface, is, quote, to recapture Kant's own conception of metaphysics and why it matters, end of quote. So my first question is more general and pertains to Kant's conception of metaphysics and what precisely his engagement with Hume's criticism can tell us about what it is and why it matters. So firstly, what is meant by metaphysics, at least in the extracts that we read? In the preface, it's stated that, quote, by metaphysics here, so here in the relevant Prolegomena passages, Kant means a science of objects beyond experience, that is, objects such as God. Later, in chapter 2, Hume's attack on metaphysics is equated with, quote, a challenge to the rational origin of the concept of cause, end of quote. So based on this, on one hand, metaphysics has to do with the concept of cause, and on the other, concept of God, along with other concepts of reason, or what Kant would classify as concepts of reason, the soul, the world as a whole, and hence is theology, psychology, and cosmology. So there's certainly a connection between these two conceptions of metaphysics. We saw in the chapter how the concept of cause comes together with theology and the proofs of God. And for Hume, they would have been part of the same kind of inquiry in that they both deal with nonsensible objects. For Kant, however, the situation is much murkier, and the two above conceptions are not necessarily able to be subsumed under the term metaphysics. For example, in a 1793 text, so this is 10 years after the Prolegomena, Kant classes the concepts of the understanding, including the concept of cause, under what he calls ontology, or transcendental philosophy. Ontology, however, he says, does not belong to metaphysics proper. He calls it merely the hallway or vestibule of metaphysics. Metaphysics proper deals with supersensible objects, God, the soul, etc. The concepts of ontology, including the concept of cause, are not supersensible for Kant here, because while they have an intellectual origin, they, as he puts it in this text, refer to objects that can be given to the senses. So the thought is the concept of cause and the concepts of the understanding, even though they're a priori, they can be applied in experience. So they relate to the sensory realm, whereas God and the soul have nothing to do, no connection at all with the sensible world. So on this classification, at least, it would be somewhat inaccurate to call Hume's attack on the causal principle as an attack on metaphysics, or at least a direct attack on metaphysics. So the above example of one of Kant's classifications of metaphysics comes from a later text, and when referring to Hume 10 years earlier in the Prolegomena, Kant is perhaps using the term metaphysics differently, perhaps in the way that Hume uses it. In general, throughout the critical period, Kant's use of the term metaphysics is murky, possibly evolving, possibly context dependent, possibly confused, possibly inconsistent. So my first question is, what does metaphysics mean for Kant when he is responding to Hume's challenge to metaphysics? And how does it relate to his own conception of metaphysics, if it is in fact different? The reason for this question is that if we do read Kant's concern with Hume's objection in the standard way, as centered around the causal principle more narrowly, then the job of identifying and assessing Kant's response is fairly straightforward. So, namely, to Hume's claim that the concept of cause is a bastard of the imagination, Kant responds in the second analogy that it is in fact a universal and necessary concept because it's a condition on our ability to distinguish between objects and events, in short. So that's kind of an advantage of the traditional account of the Kant-Hume relation, I take it. There's a neat and clearly identifiable response. If, however, we read Hume's challenge as primarily related to metaphysics on Kant's understanding, then Kant's actual response becomes much more shrouded in mystery. So here's 5, just off the top of my head, possible responses that Kant could have given or gave to Hume on this, based on various conceptions of metaphysics that appear in Kant's work. So number 1, he agrees with Hume, metaphysics is indeed not possible. We can apply the concept of causality within experience, but cognition of the supersensible is beyond our cognitive ken. Option 2, here he disagrees with Hume and says metaphysics is indeed possible, albeit in a qualified way. We have the right to use the pure concepts of reason, such as God, in a regulative way to satisfy our cognitive needs, and that's sufficient to ease Hume's skeptical worries. Option 3, another version of the above. It's possible to construct a system of pure reason with the proviso that we merely think these concepts, the concepts that it contains, and to call this metaphysics. For a sketch of what this looks like, there's chapter 8, I think, of Karen de Boer's book that was already mentioned, contains one. So that's another option. Option 4, Kant would be saying metaphysics is possible, but from a practical perspective. Namely, the pure concepts of metaphysics can be used to determine our will rather than objects, and thus take on a kind of objective validity in a practical sense somehow. Finally, option number 5, a variation of all of the above, or of at least the previous 3, which combines the practical and theoretical. So it would go something like, we have a practical warrant for determining objects, external objects, metaphysical objects, in a theoretical manner. However, we're to understand how this works, it might be what Kant is getting at when he talks about a practical dogmatic metaphysics in later texts, which he emphasizes is not merely practical, which is the idea one might get from the second critique. So I'm sure there are more options or combinations of the above, but in sum, my first question is, if the question is metaphysics, what is Kant's response? this might take us beyond the scope of the book, but if this issue is left unclear, then the aim of recapturing, quote, Kant's own conception of metaphysics might be left somewhat incomplete. Okay, second question relates to the transition from causality to God. So among this one's more specific to the chapter that we read. So among one of the central claims of this chapter, chapter 2, is that if the concept of cause does not have a rational origin and really is a bastard of the imagination, as Hume purports, then we can not only not know God and other metaphysical objects, but we cannot even think them. So, for example, it's stated that Hume's argument, quote, rules out both the possibility of proving the existence of a creator and the possibility even of conceiving of such a being, end of quote. Furthermore, it's argued that Kant is aware that Hume's argument entails this impossibility and is explicitly concerned with it. So, quote, this is what Kant had in mind when in the Critique of Practical Reason, he says that Hume aimed to deny reason all judgment about God, freedom, or immortality, namely, that he wished to deny reason the ability not just to know, but to think such causes or objects beyond experience. So I have several sub-questions related to this point of the thinkability of God and other metaphysical objects. So number one, in the Prolegomena and elsewhere, Kant responds to the challenge to natural theology contained in Hume's dialogues. These dialogues of Hume's seem to be precisely an attempt to think God. Is he more like a supreme architect or more like a stupid mechanic? Or is he perhaps like a giant vegetable? These are the kinds of questions the characters of the dialogues entertain. But if according to Hume we can't even think the first cause, what then is going on here? True, we are thinking the deity indirectly by analogy with the sensible world, but if we accept that, as the characters agree, that God's powers infinitely exceed our sensible concepts, why can't we say that we are, in fact, thinking God? 2, in the reception of the dialogues, I'm going to skip number 2 and go to number 3. In the reception of the dialogues, historically, there's some debate about whether Hume's representative is Cleanthes, the liberal theologian, or Philo, the skeptic. However, if Hume believes that we cannot even think God, then his most accurate spokesperson would be Demea, the mystic who claims that God is so far beyond our powers of understanding that he is inconceivable. Demea is portrayed as a typical dogmatist, overly pious, a bit obtuse, pompous, ultimately a bit ridiculous. Is he Hume's representative in the dialogues? Question 4. In the Prolegomena, Kant states that the deistic concept of God, the one used in deism, is one in which we, quote, think the first being, think, in italics, we think the first being by means of ontological predicates alone, of substance, cause, etc. So this is precisely what, according to the book, Hume says we can't do. So then Kant adds that this is, in fact, quote, something one must do to think God through these ontological predicates. Since reason, Kant continues, being driven in the sensible world, cannot have any satisfaction at all without this being done. And Kant adds, it is something one very well can do without falling into anthropomorphism. So Kant says one can and must think the deity through the concept of cause, among others. And presumably this includes those that deny the rational origin of the concept of cause, such as Hume. But this seems to clash with Kant's interpretation of Hume, or at least the interpretation presented by Abraham in the book, of Hume as someone who believes we cannot even think the deity. 5, in the Prolegomena, Kant claims that Hume's objections to deism are weak. However, as stated in the excerpt we read, if Kant considered Hume's refutation of the causal principle to be incontrovertible, and if deism is the procedure of merely thinking God through the concept of cause, and if we cannot think God without the concept of cause, Hume's refutation of deism should be incontrovertible. why does Kant consider it to be merely weak? So the thought is, for deism, we merely think the concept of God through a priori concepts such as causality, or through concepts such as causality. Hume's refutation of the causal principle, or of its derivation through mere concepts, is incontrovertible for Kant, so Kant accepts that. But in that case, why are Hume's objections to deism weak? So Hume's objections to deism should then be, well, causal principle is a bastard of the imagination, we can't even think God, therefore it's ruled out incontrovertibly. 6, at a more general level, I'm not sure I see why the nature of the origin of the causal principle would help me to think of metaphysical objects. So if I imagine that I'm a Humean who denies the rational origin of the causal principle, and I try to think God, I imagine, I don't know, some X or some nothing or whatever it is I imagine. If I run that same exercise, pretending I'm a Kantian, who's convinced of the rational origin of this principle, what I think comes out the same. So I'm not sure how the origin of the causal principle or its rationality will help me to think or not think God or a metaphysical object. In this case, it will have a bearing on whether I am able to ascribe objective validity to it, but I'm not sure if it will change what it is that I think when I try to think God. There are obstacles certainly to thinking God. A traditional one that it's contradictory to think God through sensible predicates, through sensible concepts, which are the only ones I have at my disposal. So there's a contradiction between my sensible way of thinking and God's supersensible nature. But that difficulty seems to be down to the law of non-contradiction rather than to the nature of the origin of the causal principle. So in some, moving from the concept of cause to the concept of God, or from the vestibule to metaphysics proper, if the former lacks objective validity, so will the latter. Yeah, so that's we can accept. So if the concept of cause lacks objective validity or does not have a rational origin, the concept of God won't either. But I don't see exactly how or why a lack of objective validity in the former will make it impossible to think the latter. Namely the concept of God in general, or that Kant believes this to be the case based on his treatment of the dialogues in particular. Perhaps the question is more simply, what does it mean to think something in this context? And perhaps this will bring us back to the question I started with, what is metaphysics for Kant? Because presumably this, at a minimum, entails some kind of thinking or another of God and other metaphysical objects. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Pavl, for these very detailed and interesting questions. So Abraham, I will hand back over to you. There's a lot to respond to, but we have a lot of time. So I will let you respond at length before opening the floor to other questions and comments.
Okay. Thank you so much, Pavl. Your questions are really beautiful. And they're also humbling because you're revealing to me what happens if you spend many years working on something. You can think that you've made some things very clear and nevertheless have failed to do so. And that's clearly what happened here. And it's humbling because I know you to be a very careful reader. So, so let's see. I guess maybe I can start by saying, even before I look at my notes on your comments, that I want to distinguish between what Kant says about Hume's initial demonstration that we can't know the relation of a cause, we can't know a cause from an effect a priori, and that's what Kant calls incontrovertible. I want to distinguish that sharply from the conclusions that Hume, according to Kant, draws from that demonstration. So Kant accepts the demonstration, but he rejects or resists the conclusions. the demonstration entails that we cannot know a cause outside experience, because we're not entitled to an unrestricted causal principle or to causal inferences via pure concepts. It does not entail, in Kant's view, that that we're not entitled to a concept that would allow us to think an object outside experience. But he thinks that Hume thought that it did. Now, your point about the dialogues is very interesting and very important. And I fully acknowledge that it's true. Of course, Hume engaged in a detailed criticism of natural religion arguments to God from the order of the world. And that's represented in the Inquiry, which is the text that Kant knew at the time he was conceiving the critique, in section 11. Or I mean, the version Kant read, of course, didn't have sections, but essays. But I think what Kant is referring to when he talks about Hume's question, because it's Kant who says this, not I. Kant says that Hume's question was whether the concept of cause had an origin in reason and might therefore be capable of an application beyond objects of experience. And I think what he's thinking of there in particular is the argument at the very conclusion of section 11, which is far more radical than the argument which occupies the body of section 11. Because the body of section 11 corresponds roughly to what you have in the dialogues. It's an argument against the possibility of inferring any more perfection in a cause of the world than we find in the thing, in the supposed effect. In the last paragraph of section 11, 11th paragraph 30, Hume gives this far more radical argument, and he gives this one in his own person, whereas the other one was given in the voice of an, sort of imagined friend. And that concluding argument is that we can't know a unique cause or the cause of a unique effect, since we conceive, since our notion of cause and effect involves constant conjunction. It involves relations between species of events and others, and one species and another species. And we don't have that in the case of unique objects, causes or effects. But it's not just an argument against the possibility of knowing a cause of the whole world. In fact, it's an argument against the very possibility of such a cause, or alternatively, of conceiving such a cause, because our concept of cause and effect is the concept of constant conjunction, as he had argued in the second part of section 7. He doesn't spell all that out in the last paragraph of section 11, but that's what he's thinking of. And I think when Kant describes Hume's question as being about whether the concept of cause has an origin in reason and might therefore be capable of an application beyond objects of experience, what he's doing is he's indicating the relation between Hume's conclusion in the second part of section 7, that the concept of cause is a product of habit, and the conclusion of section 11, which is this denial, not just that we could know a cause, a unique cause, or a cause of a unique effect, but that there could even be such a thing, because the very concept of cause it doesn't allow for it. So that's okay. That's one thing. Of course, it's quite true that Hume does, nevertheless, discuss various conceptions of God. That's absolutely true. And what Kant means in saying that Hume's arguments against deism are weak, I mean, he's clearly talking about the dialogues, as that's explicit. But there he's, I suppose, that's an independent line of argument on Hume's part and of response from Kant, I would say, that's independent of the more radical argument that is posed by Hume's question. And I think it's that more radical line of argument that Kant is referring to, not just in his description of Hume's question, but in the preface to the Critique of Practical Reason, when he said that Hume wants to deny reason all judgment concerning God, freedom, and immortality. He's not just talking about the kind of argument, I mean, the dialogues are relevant there, of course, but he's not just talking about those arguments. I think he's talking about arguments arising from the fact that the concept of cause is a product of the imagination and therefore can't be applied beyond experience at all. And I think that becomes clear when you put the remark in the preface to the Critique of Practical Reason together with the extended discussion of Hume in the section on the right of reason to an extension in its practical use to which it's not entitled and speculative, because that is all about the categories. You know, it's all about how Hume's denial that the concept of cause has a rational origin would make it impossible to do what Kant wants to do, which is to defend the possibility of, you know, thinking God and so on, thinking freedom. It doesn't, that, in other words, that part of Kant's response to Hume doesn't have to do with the arguments of the dialogues, but with Hume's treatment of the concept of cause, which Kant then extends to the other, what Kant regards as pure concepts or categories. Your other question about what Kant means by metaphysics, that's beautiful. And I confess, it's been a long time since I read the Fortschritte. And so, you know, those remarks about the distinction between metaphysics and the vestibule to metaphysics, I find extremely interesting. I do think Kant there is speaking somewhat differently from the way he speaks in the Prolegomena, although, and not just in the preface, but in the body of the Prolegomena, although in a way he's moving in that direction, because in the Prolegomena too, he says that the heart, you know, that what really matters in metaphysics is the ideas. So that's, but he seems to be allowing for ontology to be part of metaphysics, which would be, after all, the traditional way of looking at things. That is to say, if you go to Aristotle's metaphysics, you have first the question of being, and then you conclude with theology. And of course, that's true for the rationalists too. It's true for the whole tradition. So that way of phrasing things in the Fortschritte is extremely interesting. In a way, I think it does fit what I'm saying about what Kant says about what really matters both to him and to Hume with respect to metaphysics. But I think that what I'm really trying to do is simply gloss Kant's remark that Hume attacked metaphysics, and that and particularly that his description of the first step in that attack, which is this argument that we can't know the relation between a cause and an effect a priori through pure concepts. That leads to the conclusion that there is no metaphysics and cannot be any. But it seems to me that that initial demonstration is itself, it's not just something that leads up to those conclusions, which Kant rejects. It's also itself part of the attack. And I think one reason for supposing that Kant saw it that way as well is that that step is the step which involves the denial that we can know causes beyond experience, which Kant completely accepted. The second step, I mean, the later step that we can't, that the concept of cause is a bastard of the imagination, that's what Kant wanted to resist. And I think both of those are crucial to Hume's attack on metaphysics as Kant understood it and to Kant's response, but in different ways. The first one is crucial because it led Kant to conclude that we're not entitled to any kind of, for example, cosmological or other causal proof of the existence of God. So, and it strongly informs the critique of traditional proofs that you find not just in the transcendental ideal, but in the Beweisgrund already. even though Kant's critique of the cosmological proof is not exactly the same as the little one that Hume kind of hints at, nevertheless, the treatment of causal proofs. Anyway, this is complicated territory, so I don't want to make claims that are too strong. But I think it also, I do think there are reasons for thinking that it also inspired the antinomy. At any rate, that's an attractive hypothesis because it allows one to understand the relation between Kant's declaration de Garve and what he says in the Prolegomena. I think you can link those two, as I suggested, through the notion of rationalist principle of sufficient reason. Okay, but setting that aside, we have the problem of the concept of cause, which is, as you say, it's related to the vestibule, the metaphysics will call it in the Fortschritte. But Kant is very much concerned to defend the rational origin of the concept of cause against Hume, and that's the enterprise, I would say, of the transcendental analytic. I guess, I mean, this is one of the reasons I've been delighted to be starting to get to know Karin's book, because I feel as if what she says there and what I'm saying here actually fit very nicely together. I think that you can see what Kant is doing in the transcendental analytic precisely as an attempt to save a version of ontology from Hume, and to in what he's doing when he does that. If you think of the transcendental deduction, I think what Kant is doing is, I forget why I wanted to make this remark. It was a response to something you said, but yeah, it had to do with your 5 Kantian responses. That Kant is trying to, I guess you say, your second hypothesis was that we have the right to use the pure concepts of reason, such as God, in a regulative way to satisfy our cognitive needs, and that's sufficient to ease Hume's skeptical worries. Well, the project is actually to save pure concepts generally. That in turn is necessary if we want to save the rational origin of the ideas, but it's also, it's sort of, it holds the whole thing together. What else did I wanted to say?
I could suggest, Abraham, that we open the floor to questions now.
Yeah, maybe that's right. I seem to be running into the sand here, so I'd like to hear from other people.
Great, because I'm sure many of these issues will return. But thank you very much for this reply. And I will ask then if audience members, if you would like to raise your hand using the reactions button if you have a question. As ever, if you could turn on your cameras, if at all possible, so that we can see you, it would be very nice, particularly if you're asking a question, but in any case. And I'd like also to ask if questions could be kept as short and direct as possible. So we have 40 minutes for further discussion. So please use the raise hand function if you would like to ask a question. Okay, so we have a first question from Henny Blommer.
Thank you very much, Abraham, for your book. I enjoyed really reading, not the whole book, not yet, but the parts that we had to prepare for this evening. I have a very small question, and it has to do with your translation of Erinnerung. It's perhaps not a very important point, but it struck me that you you were dealing quite longly with the issue of this translation. And of course, it's not memory. But then it struck me, why do you choose objection, which is not really, in my view, the most fitting translation of the right interpretation of the term Erinnerung. It would be something like a warning or admonishment rather than an objection. I mean, objection seems to be more in line with a philosophical strategy already. And I think the word that Kant uses there, die Erinnerung des David Hume, has a softer connotation than objection. And it also has another connotation because he reminded us of something. Hume reminded us of something, but by translating it as objection, I think this is perhaps more interpretation than translation. It's a very simple point.
Thank you, Henny. Well, certainly objection is not the only possible translation. Keimendal suggests monitio, which is close to admonition, I guess. Basically, the main thing is that it has to be understood in such a way that it's continuous with the other expressions that Kant uses in the preface. The attack on metaphysics, the question, the hint, the problem. He uses like 7 or 8 different expressions. And I'm not that concerned. I mean, I chose it because it seemed to me convenient, and it seems to me it does represent what Kant has in mind, maybe. If you look at the way Kant himself uses Erinnerung elsewhere in the Prolegomena, I think sometimes he uses it to mean memory, but on a number of occasions which I referred to, he does use it in a way that seems to me really to mean critical objection. Or if you look at the way Sulzer uses it, in Sulzer's edition of the Inquiry, he follows each essay or section with a discussion which he calls Erinnerungen. And his Erinnerungen are not merely soft admonitions. They're systematic critical objections. And so I guess, I mean, I'm interested in your suggestion about what it might mean, but I think that I don't think one should think of a reminder exactly, unless by reminder you mean precisely a critical objection, because it's not. There's been so much confusion through the idea that Kant was vaguely, incoherently remembering something which he mixed up with something else. And it's been inspired by the translation of Erinnerung as memory. Of course, that's not the only source for those accounts of Kant's cloudy mental processes, but they've been supported by that translation. So that's one reason I would avoid translating it in this context as a reminder. Although if there hadn't been that history of confusion, I might not mind.
May I add something to this?
Sure.
I think my preference for a word with a softer connotation would be that Kant still wants to distinguish his account sharply from that of Hume in terms of its greatness, so to say. Whether he's right or not, that's another topic. But it seems to me that Kant, the connotation here is, well, Hume made this remark but didn't know well how to deal with it. And this remark was only dealing with the concept of causality. Whereas Kant, did this enormous task to sum up not only the concepts of the pure understanding, but also the principles. And it's only in these very much more ambitious philosophical project that Kant tells his readers that he has done and not Hume, that we arrive at a final solution, so to say. So I think by calling something a reminder or an admonishment rather than an objection, I think Kant is perhaps subtly weakening the importance of what Hume has done in comparison to what he has done himself. So it might be something strategical in Kant's way to point to the importance of his own project, and whereas in comparison Hume's remark, so to say, was very important, but has to be seen in the context of a philosophical project that was much less important.
Well, may I briefly respond? I think on the one hand, you're quite right that Kant wants to say, he says he had nothing to go on in writing the critique, but Hume's wink, Hume's hint, and that Hume merely provided a funken, a little spark what it needed was some tinder, So on the one hand, he does speak of Hume as having only supplied the starting point. On the other hand, he begins and ends his remarks about Hume very differently. He begins by saying that the most important event in the history of metaphysics was the attack that Hume made on it.
Since Locke, no?
No, he first says, the most important event since the essays of Leibniz, Locke and Leibniz, or rather since the very beginning of the subject.
Okay, yeah.
And he concludes by speaking of that he's afraid that the same thing will happen to the execution of Hume's problem in its widest possible elaboration. And then he puts in parentheses, the critique of pure reason, as happened to Hume himself. So there, he seems really to be once again identifying the critique wholly with Hume's problem, only that Kant developed it in every possible way. So that makes room for what you're saying in the sense, and Kant himself, as I say, certainly does speak that way, that Hume merely furnished him with a hint, although it was a crucial hint. But on the other hand, he's also saying that everything he did comes out of that hint and that out of Hume's problem.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Farhad Alavi.
Hi, can you hear me? Oh, so good. Thank you very much for the book and very interesting talk. So I have two very brief questions. First, if I'm not mistaken, in the Prolegomena, Kant makes this distinction between metaphysics in general and metaphysics in particular, and I was thinking of your discussion with Pavl. So how do you fit this distinction into the Humean or Kantian conception of metaphysics when thinking about what it means to say metaphysics is possible? So what would be the Kantian response to Hume in terms of metaphysics in general or metaphysics in particular? And the other question was, how do you read the second analogy in the Critique of Pure Reason? So what would be the Kantian response there? So I know it's a very broad question, but thank you anyway.
Okay, thank you very much. Your first question, when you speak of metaphysics in particular and in general, I think, are you thinking of what's sometimes called the distinction between special and general metaphysics?
Yeah, exactly. So metaphysics in general, meaning ontology. So the object of which is being, and in particular, which deals with soul, world, and God, of course.
Yeah, well, the special metaphysics, yeah. Well, that is closely connected with what Pavl was asking, and I think the best place to go for clarity on Kant's view of that is the discussion of Hume in the Critique of Practical Reason on the right of reason to an extension in its practical use to which it's not entitled in the speculative. Because Kant there, he talks about how the defense of pure concepts that he gave in the deduction was indispensable for saving the possibility of thinking God and freedom. So there, in that sense, Kant's revised version of ontology, which is a response to Hume, is fundamental for defending his revised version of special metaphysics, also against Hume. What was the second question?
Second analogy,
I forgot.
the first critique.
Sorry?
Kant's second analogy in the first
yes,
yeah.
Right. Well, I talk about that a bit in the preface. One of the, I think, yeah, I do. One of the way I see it is this, that the second analogy, Kant says in Prolegomena section 30, where he's discussing his solution to Hume's problem. He says, well, you know, that solution involved the argument of the second analogy. And this has made some people think, well, that Hume's problem itself in its original form must have involved an attack on the causal principle. Now, that can't be true, since according to Hume himself, he never rejected the causal principle. And I think Kant's remark that Hume never doubted that the concept of cause was correct, usable, and indispensable for the whole knowledge of nature extends to the causal principle. And Kemp Smith, by the way, although he talks in his Kant commentary as if Hume had attacked that principle and that's what Kant was responding to, he insists, not just in his book on Hume, but even in his early article on Hume in Mind, that Hume never questioned that principle. And Kant, I think, was fully aware of that. So what Hume did, of course, question was the rational basis of that principle. And Kant's defense of the rational basis of the causal principle when restricted to experience, I think it forms part of his response to Hume's question as described in the Prolegomena, because it supports his defense of the pure origin of the concept of cause. And so that the problem of the deduction is, I think, more fundamental than the problem of the second analogy for him. And it's also the problem that he got interested in, that Hume drew his attention to first. I think he started to worry about it quite early, as soon as he read the inquiry. I don't think he really started to worry about the rational basis of the causal principle as it applies to experience. Well, you could argue that he's thinking about it in maybe in the negative magnitudes and the spirits here, but I think really there he's thinking about individual causal connections. I think he doesn't really start to worry about it until the 1770s. So, which is in line, that in that sense, I'm agreeing, I would agree with Weihinger and company.
Thank you.
The next question is from Karen de Boer.
Okay, thanks. Yes, so I'm largely in agreement with your approach to the relationship Kant and Hume, and I really enjoyed reading your book, at least part of it. So I think it's very illuminating and clear, and also convincing up to a point, because I also have some question marks. And one of my questions concerns your reading of Hume, because I had the impression that you somehow maybe do not sufficiently emphasize the role of Hume's account of causality in terms of something that requires repeated observation and the role of the imagination and habit and so on. So also in your response to Pavl, you presented it as a second step in Hume's reasoning. But it seems to me it is the first one. That is to say that Hume starts from a kind of analysis of what it actually means for the human mind to draw a causal connection or to make a statement concerning cause and effect. And that it is only from this observation that his critique of the principle of causality gets its weight. Yes, because otherwise, if you, I sometimes had the impression from reading your book that you take Hume simply to state that that the principle of causality does not have a rational source and hence cannot be used in metaphysics. As if this is a kind of, claim that can stand on its own. Whereas I think that it is the outcome of the actual argument that concerns the way in which we actually proceed when we make a causal judgment. You see my point?
Yes.
So because otherwise, I think that put different on your reading, I think that Hume's position might come across as dogmatic itself. Yes, as simply stating that causality doesn't have a rational ground, hence that it cannot be used in metaphysical types of reasoning.
Right. Well, thank you very much for the question. I guess it's perfectly true that Hume's argument that we don't know causal relations a priori is interwoven with the discussion of how we do arrive at causal judgments in the first part of section 4. But I think it's worth taking seriously the fact that Kant, when he is talking about Hume's attack on metaphysics, emphasizes only what one might call the most abstract element in Hume's, at least in the first step, his description of the first step of Hume's attack on metaphysics. He emphasizes the more abstract part of Hume's argument in the first part of section 4, which goes from the second paragraph of section 4, that the contrary of every matter of fact is always is still possible because it implies no contradiction, directly, or rather that leads, that is that's the logical basis of Hume's conclusion at the end of the first part of section 4 and the last part of section 13, that we can't know the relation between any object and any other object a priori. It's true that in between he talks about experience, but I think the fundamental reason for denying that we have the thing that Kant rather calls attention to as the starting point of Hume's attack on metaphysics is that logical argument against the possibility of knowing the relation between cause and effect through mere ideas a priori. In Kant's description of the attack on metaphysics, Kant goes on and says that from this Hume concluded that, and here he's talking not about section 4 but about section 7, that the concept concept of cause is nothing but a bastard of the imagination. But Kant was of course aware that Hume had a whole account of causal judgment, individual causal inferences as based on experience and so on, not just the concept of cause. But Kant, and I think rightly, doesn't take that to be fundamental to Hume's attack on metaphysics. And I mean, Kant actually says something extremely interesting in his description of Hume's attack on metaphysics. And that is that, first he says that Hume Hume's first conclusion was that the concept of cause is a bastard of the imagination, which doesn't come from reason, but habit. And that reason can't conceive it even in general. And that all the purportedly a priori subsisting cognitions of reason are mere falsely reminted concepts, common experiences. And from there, he says, and there's no metaphysics and can't be any. So Kant makes the striking claim that Hume's empiricism is actually an inference from this argument that we can't know the relation between cause and effect a priori. Now, this is surprising from the point of view of the way people usually read Hume, because after all, Hume introduces his empiricism before he discusses cause in section 4. And you might get the impression, reading the inquiry, or that that the whole thing is fundamentally a part of a science of human nature. But according to Kant, that's not actually the case. According to Kant, the empiricism is itself a conclusion from the argument against the possibility of, I would say, against the principle of sufficient reason. And I think that suggestion that Kant is making makes tremendous sense, because from a rationalist perspective, if we're not entitled to the principle of sufficient reason or something like that, then then really there's no basis for claiming that we have access to non-empirical concepts or any knowledge of except through experience. That's something I hope to explore further elsewhere. And one of the strange things about my book is that I want to acknowledge that there is this very important aspect to Hume's attack on metaphysics, according to Kant, which I barely discuss at all, and that is the empiricism. And Kant's response to that empiricism is also essential to Kant's response to Hume. Those things are extremely important, both for Hume and for Kant. But in this book, I wanted to focus just on what Kant says about the first step in Hume's attack on metaphysics, and just to avoid confusion, and to leave a discussion of Hume's conclusions and Kant's response to those conclusions for elsewhere. So I know I'm making big claims, and they require a lot of justification, but I guess that's what I would say.
Okay, thanks. Steve, can I ask a kind of follow-up question?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so in your response to me, you also mentioned, of course, the principle of sufficient reason, and I had a kind of follow-up question on this concept, because I sometimes had the impression that in your discussion, you kind of separate the principle of sufficient reason from the principle of causality, maybe to a larger extent than is actually necessary. And I sometimes even thought that the relationship between Kant and Hume can also be understood by focusing simply on the principle of causality, especially if you focus on section 11 and Hume's framing of the problem in terms of God considered as cause of the universe. Yeah, so the type of metaphysics that he attacks more or less implicitly in section 11 is it is an attack that is mounted by taking recourse to the concept of causality and claiming that we cannot take God to be the cause of the universe simply because there is no possibility to have a kind of repeated experience of a similar sequence of events. So that criticism, which I think is really crucial, does not require a kind of account of the principle of sufficient reason. And secondly, I think that the principle of sufficient reason is is maybe too broad to be very useful, because it also pertains to pertains to the classical view that all determinations of something follow from its essence. Yeah, so for instance, so on a Leibnizian perspective, the whiteness of the snow follows from the very essence of the snow. And this is a relationship between ground and consequence, but it's not a relationship between cause and effect. Yes, the essence of something is not the cause of in this case the whiteness of the snow. And so so maybe you have two options here. Either you say, well, Hume is first and foremost interested in the principle of sufficient reason insofar as it pertains to causes, or you state, well, Hume was also interested in attacking this other aspect of the principle of sufficient reason, according to which there is a problem with positing something as the consequence of something else. Well, I don't know if this is clear, but my own choice would be to limit the focus on the principle of causality, and not take also on board the broader meaning of the principle of sufficient reason. But I'm not really sure what your take is on this in the book.
Well, that's a beautiful question. Thank you very much, Karin. And it's, I mean, I had some terminological problems, because, of course, if you say that Kant was persuaded by Hume to abandon the principle of sufficient reason, that can easily be misunderstood, because Kant, of course, claims to defend the principle of sufficient reason when restricted to experience, and claims to prove it. So, you know, I chose the term simply because I wanted an expression that would refer to German metaphysics and the causal principles understood in German metaphysics. But I also tried hard to explain that, of course, Hume himself never actually uses that expression. And it's rather that Kant was applying Hume's criticism of the Cartesian causal principle to the causal principle, the causal aspect of the principle of sufficient reason as it's deployed by Wolff and so on. But it's not just that aspect of the principle that mattered to Kant. And if one is to try to get the antinomy to emerge from Hume's questioning of the principle of sufficient reason, one has to think about other aspects of the principle. And that's where, for example, Hume's discussion of space and time in section 12, 18 and 19 becomes relevant, because, you know, I don't think I could prove exactly, maybe one can provide some evidence that those discussions contributed to Kant's reflections on space and time when read against the background of other things like Bale. But there the principle is being thought of as a principle of composition, as it is also in the arguments about space between Leibniz and the Newtonians. But what you say about properties is extremely important. And you're helping me, because both with Kant and with Hume, because one of the questions that I've had about Hume is, how much is Hume, in fact, thinking of Leibniz's position as a whole? He has that little remark in paragraph 28 of section 12, when he is denying that he doesn't put it this way, of course, but that existence is a real predicate. And he talks about Caesar. I've got my copy of the inquiry here, and says that Okay. That the cube root of 64 is equal to the half of 10 is a false proposition and can never be distinctly conceived. But that Caesar or the angel Gabriel or any being never existed may be a false proposition, but is perfectly conceivable and implies no contradiction. So I think that raises the question of how much Kant is thinking about, or rather Hume is thinking about Leibnizian complete concepts and that sort of thing. And how much Kant might have taken him to be doing so. Another thing that raises that question from Kant's point of view is the little remark Kant makes in section 3 of the Prolegomena, when he said the only hint he'd been able to find about synthetic judgments a priori was a little remark of Locke's about, and he cites the paragraph in the essay, and it's a place where Locke is discussing flame. And in fact, what Locke is discussing there is the coexistence of different properties in different ideas in the idea of something. And that, I think that rather indirectly, but it raises the question of to what extent was Kant's reflection on synthetic a priori that was inspired by, or that had some relation to this Locke remark, to what extent was it related to his reflection on the things that Hume says about our knowledge of essence in section 4? You know, that we can't know, we don't know a priori that bread is nourishing, all those remarks. Because, you know, if read in a certain way, it might suggest that part of what Hume did for Kant was indeed to stimulate him to think about the problem of real essence and the relation between properties and substance. But I have to think more about what you're saying, and in fact, I would very much welcome your further thoughts about it. And thank you very much.
Great, thank you. So I'd like to ask a question if I could, and this relates to some passages which I think are.
Excuse me, my wife is entering
my
my study. I'm sorry. Let me just let her in.
You're muted, Abraham. I don't know if you were saying anything. Are you back?
I'm back. Please continue.
Okay, great. Yes, I wanted to ask you about two passages that I think are important for, well, I personally think are important. And I think they seem to me to go in a different direction to your account. So these are the, in the Discipline, where Kant calls Hume a geographer of reason. And in paragraph 57 of the Prolegomena, where Kant talks about the unpoliced dialectic. And you briefly talk about the Discipline passage, but I wonder perhaps not in fully what I think is relevant. And so as what I take Kant to be saying in these two passages is basically that Hume is correct to say that we cannot extend the causal principle beyond experience. But the problem is that this made Hume question whether there is causality in experience. And then particularly in the Prolegomena passage, Kant says, this is fine because sound common sense shows us that there is causality. But the problem is that this brings reason into disrepute. So this is a more standard understanding of Kant's response to Hume. But I think what's interesting to me, at least, I wrote a paper about this recently, is that in the Discipline passage, Kant then goes on to say that Hume is fine insofar as he is limiting our cognition, but the problem is that he doesn't set determinate boundaries to it. And so Kant is using this distinction between limits and boundaries. And I just wonder what you make of these two passages, which seem to, as I say, go in a different direction.
Okay, well, as to the passage in the Discipline, Kant says that Hume is mostly interested in attacking metaphysics, but he also extends his attack to the what goes on within experience. I don't think he's there saying that Hume denies causal connection within experience. I think all he's saying is that Hume denies that there's a rational basis for the causal principle within experience. But I don't know if that has to. And how are you seeing the remark about unpoliced dialectic as bearing on what I was saying?
Well, this sort of argument that I just tried to sketch, I think, comes from this. So I have the passage here. Okay. Skepticism originally arose from metaphysics and its unpoliced dialectic. So this seems to be almost the opposite to your claim, because first we have the kind of, well, this is, as I understand Kant's position here, that we have the legitimate skeptical claim that the causal principle can't be used unreservedly within metaphysics. And then Kant says, gradually it came to be noticed that this same a priori principles are employed in experience had led still further than experience reaches. Then even the principles of experience began to be doubted. So I read this as the same claim as in the discipline passage. And that's when Kant then says, this is still in the prolegomena, sound common sense will always assert its rights in this domain. So this doesn't matter, according to Kant, but then we are unsure how far reason is to be trusted. So I don't know if that's clear, but that's what I would want to emphasize.
Right. Well, Kant also said, he says similar things in a lot of places in the Fortschritte and at B127, speaking of Hume. I mean, I think what he says when he's describing Hume is that Hume first noticed that we can't use the causal principle beyond experience. That led him, he says, I forget, I think this is it's not the A760 passage, the one that's A764 or something, 768 maybe, that led him to the idea that it's just a product of habit. So when he says that there's a doubt of cause within experience, to some extent, in Sextus, there are such doubts, of course. And in the way he describes Hume in the Critique of Practical Reason on the right of reason to an extension, he puts it in such a way that he says, well, if you took Hume's argument really literally, it could threaten even natural science as philosophy. He doesn't say it would actually threaten natural science or empirical knowledge, but of course he's aware that you can have really radical sorts of skepticism that do threaten those things. And so he says something similar in the A preface, of course. So it's possible to take the questioning of the rational basis of the causal principle, I guess, to imply that we can't have knowledge of causes within experience. But I don't think he thinks that Hume himself is really doing that. I do think he thinks that Hume is making the wrong inference that the law of that the causal principle within experience is contingent, as he puts it elsewhere in the discipline. And the mere fact that our empirical knowledge of particular laws is contingent, Kant thinks that doesn't mean that the causal principle itself is contingent. And Hume, on the other hand, does speak as if it were. But I think he's mindful of the fact that Hume defends the doctrine of necessity in section 8 of the Inquiry, despite the fact that he does so on the basis of his denial that the concept of cause has an origin in reason at the end of section 7. So I think Kant is very alive to the surprising and paradoxical character of Hume's position. And he's aware, he knows Sextus. He knows that Hume knows Sextus, and he's aware of the possibility of skepticism about experience itself.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think we have time for one more question before the end of the formal part, if anybody would like to ask one. Yeah, so we have a question from Andrew Ward.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me all right? Yes, good. I'm sorry, I didn't manage to read anything but your preface, and I found it really enthralling. I would like to put in some word in favor of the view that what awoke Kant. I mean, it's clearly correct that Kant was awoken by Hume skepticism with regard to issues like God, freedom of the will, and so on. But it seems to me to go too far in your discussion when you suggest that that was really it, because it seems to me quite fairly clear that he was also concerned with Hume's attack on natural science and mathematics. And if you remember, in the B preface, he actually divides metaphysics into two parts. And the first part is concerned with those a priori conditions that make scientific knowledge possible. He actually says that his Copernican revolution, he doesn't call it the Copernican revolution, saves the first principles of natural science from the skepticism of Hume. And it seems to me you go too far when you suggest that he isn't interested in defending natural science and indeed mathematics when he read Hume in the Prolegomena. It seems to me he was aroused both by the worry that natural science was no longer necessary, the principles were no longer necessary, as well as worries about the existence of God, freedom of the will more particularly, and so on.
Thank you very much. Well, I mean, of course, I agree that he was interested in those things, but I don't think those are the questions that first interrupted. I don't think those are the, Andrew, maybe if I could ask you, thank you. I don't think those are the questions that first interrupted his dogmatic slumber. I think that, I mean, it's true that in the negative magnitudes and in the dreams of the spirits here, one finds him echoing Hume with respect to causal, you might say, our knowledge of causal relations in experience. So he's thinking about that. But I think that he's thinking about it not because at that time he's primarily worried about defending natural science, but because that's part of the package. That's part of Hume's, the attack on, as I see it, the principle of sufficient reason, but also the rational origin of the concept of cause with their bearing on metaphysics. And I think that he becomes more interested in defending the basis of natural science in the inaugural dissertation and thereafter. I mean, maybe there are hints of that in the negative magnitudes, I'm not sure. But, and one of the things that is interesting is that I have a favorable opinion of a paper by Gary Hatfield that he gave at the Berlin conference in 2000, in which he proposes that Kant wasn't worried about skepticism in the first edition, but a bit more in the Prolegomena and then in the second edition. And I would add the Critique of Practical Reason. I think he's a little bit off because I think Kant really is worried about skepticism in the first edition, but the skepticism he's primarily worried about is a skepticism about metaphysics. On the other hand, I accept Geyer's response to Hatfield, in which Geyer pointed out that, of course, the second analogy is also in the first edition, and that Kant, of course, is defending the rational basis of the causal principle. But But it is a striking fact that he doesn't seem to be, even in the Prolegomena, he doesn't seem that preoccupied with the fate of natural science. He says, well, natural science and mathematics don't really need to be defended. They sort of defend themselves. It's metaphysics which needs to be defended. And when he's worrying about synthetic judgments a priori, I think the emphasis really is on the possibility of synthetic judgments a priori in metaphysics. I think that's perhaps true in the first edition too. Things change in the second edition and in the Critique of Practical Reason, I think.
But all I was saying was that he does call the first principles of natural science, the defense of them, metaphysics. He does call it. If you remember, there's metaphysics in the first part and metaphysics in the second part. So I'm saying he is trying to defend metaphysics. I'm not denying that. I'm saying that he's actually defending natural science in defending metaphysics.
Well, that's a good point. And I mean, the mere existence of the metaphysical first principles of natural science shows that is very important for Kant. But my point in this book was that's not his starting point. That's not what first interrupted his dogmatic slumber.
Okay, thank you.
Let me jump in because we're at the end of time. But we will have, if Abraham is able, a sort of informal session where we will keep the Zoom meeting open for people to discuss more broadly, as we always do in these sessions. So this will happen in a moment. Before that, I just want to say a couple of things. Firstly, that our next meeting will be on November the 18th, and this will be a workshop with 3 short papers on Jacobi from 3 researchers with a response from Stefan Schick. The last thing to do then is to thank both of our speakers, so Pavl, Raichel, and particularly Abraham Anderson for their very interesting contributions and discussion.
And